Hey everyone, let's jump right into this explainer, because today we're unpacking a recent social science study that completely redefines the ancient concept of chivalry for our modern world. Now, when most of us hear the word chivalry, we usually picture, a polite guy holding an umbrella, or maybe a literal knight in shining armor on horseback. But what if I told you that this ancient code is actually a deeply embedded cultural operating system that still heavily influences our psychology today? Well, that's exactly what researcher Matthew Mosket-Inglot set out to prove. Now, to really set the stage for this, take a look at these stirring words. They were used back in 1565 during the Siege of Malta to invoke the absolute ultimate chivalric sacrifice from European knights. Grandmaster de Valette was facing just overwhelming odds against the Ottoman Turks, and notice what he did. He didn't appeal to their logic. He appealed directly to their chivalry. And scholars point out that this wasn't just a one-off medieval thing. We've seen similar rhetoric used throughout history, from World War I recruitment campaigns all the way to modern political conflicts, literally rousing combatants and the general public alike to extreme forms of behavior. And that brings us to our central mystery. How on earth does a code that once drove men to holy war and ultimate sacrifice translate into our modern everyday society? Have we truly watered down this incredibly potent psychological driving force into mere dating etiquette? Well, as we'll see, researchers are now arguing that the profound, world-shaping ideals of the medieval knight didn't just vanish into the history books, they actually evolved. All right, let's get into Section 1, the chivalry paradox. So we see this paradox literally all the time in pop culture today, right? From the Knights of Westeros in Game of Thrones to tech billionaires in shining armor like Tony Stark. But the crucial point here is that our current popular understanding of chivalry might actually be obscuring its true psychological power over us. Think about it. In our modern Western social order, which, let's be honest, often favors the worship of capital over the worship of God, we still fiercely cling to these heroic knight archetypes. But social scientists are pointing out a massive blind spot. Because we largely associate chivalry today with just a limited range of, say, paternalistic behaviors, we completely underestimate how these core values impact vital areas of our broader society. And honestly, looking at the dictionary perfectly illustrates this split personality. If you look up chivalry in the Oxford English Dictionary, you get two wildly different stories. One definition describes this massive, all-encompassing religious and moral system that perfect knights followed in the Middle Ages. We're talking bravery, justice, self-sacrifice, the whole shebang. The other definition, it very narrowly describes present-day behaviors typically enacted by men toward women, like opening car doors or paying for a meal. So the study we're exploring today asks a pretty critical question. How exactly did we get from a system that justifies shedding blood on a battlefield to a rule about who picks up the dinner check? Which brings us to Section 2. An evolving cultural complex. If we actually trace these values chronologically, we see a direct, unbroken lineage. We start way back in the classical era with the intense warrior codes of the Spartans and Romans. Those values eventually evolved and concentrated during the Middle Ages into the classic European Knights Code. But it didn't stop there, not even close. Through the conduit of the colonial era and those massive cultural imperialist projects of Europe, these values were broadcast globally. They permeated societies worldwide, leading right up to our 21st century modern society. It is essentially an unbroken chain of inherited cultural DNA. So the study introduces a new term for this, the Chivalric Culture Complex, or CCC, to describe how these abstract beliefs survive and replicate over centuries. Think of it kind of like Darwinian evolution, but for culture. These values spread through populations via social learning and something called prestige bias. That just means we naturally copy the behaviors of the people we view as having high social status, exactly like how knights across Europe copied each other's codes back in the 11th and 12th centuries. The CCC is one single continuous cultural timeline. But here's the really tricky part for researchers. If chivalry isn't just about opening doors, but is actually this deeply evolved cultural complex, how can social scientists accurately measure who is afflicted by these values today and why? We obviously can't just walk up and ask someone, hey, are you a medieval knight? We need a real, rigorous scientific instrument. And that leads us to Section 3, measuring the modern knight. To answer this, the study's author essentially had to forge a brand new scientific tool, a scale for chivalric disposition. They started by methodically pulling key traits straight out of the classic literature on medieval chivalry, words like prowess, humility, obedience, and martyrdom. From that, they generated a massive pool of 60 statements. Then, they refined those statements to fit a modern psychological survey, wording them to test how much an everyday person values these traits right now. For example, phrasing them as, "it is important for me to," and finally, they subjected all this data to heavy statistical factor analysis to see what actually stuck. They then took this shiny new survey and gave it to 242 participants, just to see which ancient values still resonated today. This sample group was largely made up of young adults from Malta, which, by the way, is a place famously steeped in knightly history, along with participants from the UK and a few other countries. The whole goal was to see if modern minds, reading these ancient concepts translated into everyday language, still naturally group their beliefs the exact same way a medieval knight would. Now, looking at this flowchart, you can see the sheer mathematical heavy lifting going on here. They didn't just guess what chivalry looks like today. They forced the data to speak for itself. They started with those 60 broad historical concepts, stripped out the redundant items, ran exploratory factor analysis, tested for reliability, and mathematically boiled it all down to just 21 hardcore, statistically significant modern traits. All this complex data was then mapped out. And check out that sharp elbow on this scree plot. It visually proves that the data naturally organizes itself into exactly 3 distinct pillars. People's answers weren't just random noise. If they valued one specific type of chivalrous trait, they consistently valued the related ones, forming this distinct tripart psychological structure that is very much alive in the modern human mind. So what are they? Let's unpack section 4, the 3 pillars. This chart is basically the ultimate reveal, proving that the chivalric culture complex isn't some random collection of habits. It functions as a unified 3-part psychological engine. Those 21 survey items map flawlessly onto 3 core traits: si forte, si defend, and si vir. Together, they create a highly reliable measure of an individual's overall chivalric disposition. Let's look at exactly what each of these 3 weird abbreviations actually means for our daily behavior. Pillar number 1 is chivalric fortitude, or C4. This perfectly captures the classic warrior's drive. In the survey, this meant people agreeing with statements about being ready and completely willing to use physical force to protect the weak or defend themselves. It's all about exceptional self-control, mental resoluteness, and a genuine willingness to endure real hardship to uphold a belief. It's that steadfast, uncompromising strength we see romanticized in movies and mass media every single day. Pillar 2 is chivalric deference, or CDEF. Honestly, this one is fascinating and maybe a little unexpected. It reveals a deep underlying tendency towards subservience. People who score high here strongly believe it's important to follow the rules, even when those rules don't make any immediate sense. It's about unwavering respect for authority, always giving your superiors the benefit of the doubt, and maintaining a very serious, modest appearance. It's basically doing nothing contrary to the interests of one's lord, but translated perfectly into a modern corporate or political hierarchy. And the final pillar is chivalric virtue, or civire. This captures that deep-seated, almost ascetic belief in absolute purity. It involves a rigid, unbending commitment to always championing good against evil. It's choosing personal honor and self-respect over making a quick buck or gaining material possessions. It represents the person who prides themselves on total impartiality and a steadfast refusal to ever steal, cheat, or lie, no matter how high the stakes get. All right, bringing it all home in section 5, why chivalry matters today. So what's the so what here? How does the discovery of this 3-part chivalric disposition actually impact our world right now? Well, as the study points out, holding on to these romanticized ideals isn't just about being a nice person. It can actually be incredibly dangerous. When we view the world through the lens of chivalric fortitude and deference, it easily allows authorities to justify modern just wars or fundamentally unjust economic systems. The author specifically notes that these higher, supposedly transcendent powers keep atrocities, quote, out of the glare of rational thought. It really begs the question, are these lasting ideals continuing to assuage the manufacturing of public consent, just like political theorists like Herman and Chomsky have been warning us about for decades? Because researchers can finally measure this disposition, they've unlocked a powerful new lens for social science. They can now study exactly how a high chivalric disposition drives our reactions to massive societal stress. Like, do highly chivalrous people react differently to global pandemic mandates because of their built-in deference to authority? Or does their strict, unyielding belief in good versus evil actually make them more susceptible to mass political disinformation? This new scale gives us the toolkit to finally start answering these vital questions. So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Are these ancient chivalric codes elevating our society? inspiring us to protect the vulnerable and maintain our personal honor? Or, by demanding such extreme deference and blind loyalty, are they secretly functioning as a subtle cultural operating system keeping us subservient to modern lords? Next time you see a hero in shining armor up on the big screen, maybe ask yourself what they're really asking you to believe. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it completely changed how you view the perfect knight.